of them wearing orange shirts, 2 of them with hard hats. And these are residents from one of the greatest slums in Rio de Janeiro. And they are the ones who actually did the work of installing the photovoltaic system on top of a school in the neighborhood. With in this instance, this was not an IEEE project, but as IEEE HAC itself notes, and as the UN Sustainable Development Goals note, partnerships are vital to having an impact any place. And so all of these are examples of organizations with which we would like to partner. Puneet, I'm sure you will give me a heads up if there are any issues with audibility or visibility of the slides.
So Daniel, we lost your slide deck.
So Puneet, would you prefer to share the slides from your end? Because I haven't changed them.
You just try once more, otherwise we will project from our end.
Okay.
Yeah.
So slide 2 is the one with the 6 gentlemen.
Mm-hmm.
And then slide 3 is a very long outline. I am displaying slide 3 right now.
Okay, we are not able to see this presently. Anyway, I will try to project from my end.
Excellent, excellent. Okay. That's why you have the slides. I had no difficulty following the slides yesterday, so that should not be a problem at this end.
It takes some time, but let us see.
Yeah. So now I can see the chat box. Any of you listening can tell me, were you able to see any of the slides?
So Daniel, you are able to see the slide?
Yes, I am.
So shall I go to the next slide?
Okay, you heard me commenting on this one. These are just scenes from different slums. These are the residents I mentioned.
Daniel, we lost you. Can you repeat again, please?
When you're ready, we can go to the 3rd slide.
Okay. Yeah.
And then so I just typed into the box, and that is our last safety net.
I hope you are seeing the 3rd slide, so you can start again.
Yes. So let's hope for clear audio. This presentation is being made for the first time. In my experience, my presentations and those of other speakers improve very rapidly with iterations. By the time you have given a talk 4 or 5 times with minor improvements to the slides, you get your timing right, you get your data correct, you include all your references. It's very smooth. So this will be a bumpy ride. This is the first time. Regarding myself, it's important to emphasize that I am not an engineer. I'm a physicist. I have limited experience conducting projects myself. I'm a volunteer like so many of you, and given the needs that existed started in 2013 when I became involved with humanitarian technology, I have found myself primarily organizing events and communicating with the volunteers who are conducting the projects, and reading reading various books that I have identified. Okay, let's see. How are we doing with the audio and the video? I don't hear any of you anymore.
Yeah, no, we are able to hear you, Daniel. You can proceed.
Okay. Okay. So the background. Let's see. What do I have here? Some of the background that is important to understanding my interest and my perspective is that while I am an American citizen, my upbringing was all in Brazil, in a country where there is tremendous poverty. You can tell from my selection of the first slide that left a very deep impression on me, where the wealthy and the poor coexist, which is something that I know is familiar to you. As I go through this, I want to briefly mention some aspects of poverty on which I have reflected, but that will not be included in the talk, but that are sort of warnings or announcements of things to watch for yourselves. What I will include, urban and rural populations. I find it very interesting that there has been attention paid in recent webinars on bringing urban advantages to rural populations across India, and that is something that is a worldwide trend. And one of the things that we can do is comment on some of the interesting insights that a particular physicist has on why that is happening. One of the books I came across is about the stunning growth of both cities and slums on the planet, and we'll talk a little bit about that. We must include the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and give some consideration to which of them are most directly applicable to urban settings and to low resource environments in urban settings. And I'll skip through these, but it's imperative that we talk about COVID-19 and the urban poor today. And in today's context, leaving that out of the discussion would not make sense. So let's go on to the next slide, please, Puneet. So, okay, so some of this has been already said in the previous slide. You can tell I am not as familiar with them as I would like to be, but the slides, that is. So, starting again near the middle of those, some of what has influenced my perspective on urban poverty is my binational Brazil-USA background, and my involvement with sustainable development and humanitarian technology dates back to 2013. When I worked with the Humanitarian Technology Conference, but soon after that, I found myself on the Humanitarian Activities Committee, started a local site group, and eventually served as chair of site. which means I have indirect contact with dozens and dozens and dozens of projects, having spoken to them, seen reports, read proposals, and that has been useful. So an expected outcome or consequence of our conversation this evening is that word will spread that I am on the team of people who care about urban poverty, and some of you who maybe are already way ahead of me will help bring me up to speed. And those of you who find this to be an interesting lens through which to view humanitarian technology may support me in what I'm doing. And the bottom bullet is just because perhaps there are some of you on the call who will say, well, Daniel does not know what he's talking about. We can do better than him. So compete with me. Do better than I do. That is fine too. Puneet, next slide. So this is a topic, this is a slide. At the top, the title is Poverty, Inevitability Affirmed by Some Due to the Second Law of Thermodynamics. There have been physicists or others who understand the second law of thermodynamics who insist that poverty, even extreme poverty, as well as extreme wealth, are inevitable because of the second law of thermodynamics. This is not a topic of today's discussion. That's on the slide. It's extremely interesting, and if you hear about it or come across it and are worried, by all means contact me. But the basic premise has to do with an analogy between wealth and energy, and the origin, the statistical mechanics origin of entropy and the increase of entropy in an isolated system, the relationship between that and a quantum mechanical or microscopic view of a system in terms of microstates. So if you distribute energy evenly to 10 to the 23rd molecules in a container, the distribution will not remain even very long. They're all moving, they're spinning, they collide with each other, and you very quickly see that distribution of energy spread. And if you were to imagine an analogy involving wealth or money, including non-monetary wealth, possessions in general, real estate, vehicles, means of production, businesses. If you were to distribute all of that so that everybody is equally wealthy or poor, right, that the words would cease to have meaning if everyone had the same quantity, that given the reality of free market economy and human nature, you would very rapidly see a differentiation. People would begin exchanging wealth, and soon you would have the distribution again. So poverty and wealth will always be present. The question is, or my assertion is that humans are not molecules, and statistical mechanics does not apply to humans the way it does to molecules. Civilization can establish legislation and safety nets. The other things that is missing from molecules and inherent in the second law of thermodynamics is that molecules are not capable of caring about each other or loving each other, and humans are. So I have confidence that we can eliminate extreme poverty. Next slide.
Here.
So this slide says sustainable technology equals question mark. So what do we mean by technology is any technology that supports the achievement of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. And I have a footmark noting that I truly believe any technology. We are engineers, physicists, material scientists, chemists, and we are very enthusiastic about artificial intelligence and self-driving cars. Yesterday we had a splendid presentation on electric vehicles. I drive an electric vehicle. But when it comes to addressing poverty, and for today's purposes, urban poverty, even something as simple as a pipe with water or a storage cistern for water or a simple building for storing bags of food, hammers and nails, I include those in the larger set of technology. I will pause because I can see from the chat box that we have some issues. What would you like to suggest, Puneet?
Slides are not visible.
That's what I'm seeing. Yeah, people.
They are telling slides visible. Chengappa, are you able to see the slides? Daniel, you are able to see the slide or not?
No, right now I don't. I mean, I can if I go to PowerPoint.
Yeah, so
We are able to see.
but few people are telling it is visible, few people are telling it's not visible.
No, slides are visible.
Yeah, slides
it is
are
not
visible.
visible, sir.
Slides are visible.
No, not visible, not visible.
No, sir, slides are not visible.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, 1 second.
They have to restart their due to some connectivity and all, you lose them.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, now it is visible.
Now,
Yeah, okay.
now visible.
Yeah, okay.
I request all of you to mute yourself as well as switch off your video feed. I think sometimes bandwidth related issues are there.
Okay.
Yeah, Daniel, you can proceed now.
Okay. If we switch off our video feeds, will that freeze? Oh, the video feeds. Okay, I mean, you're referring to feeds from people's cameras. Yes. So there may be some confusion. We switch off the cameras, but we retain the slides. Okay. Because
no, so slide after presenting, you can go ahead. Yeah.
Because if it were necessary, I would view the slides, you would just listen, and then later people would view the slides. That would be very disappointing, but it would be something. Okay, so next slide.
Yeah.
And I will ask the group, and you can type in the chat box whether you have heard most of what I said so far. Even without the slides, have you followed some of the chain of thought? Excellent, thank you. Heard and followed, yes, okay. Okay, and my intention was to tell Puneet, do not share the slides afterwards because they are not ready to publish. But because of these difficulties, maybe we will make an exception to that. Okay, so I believe you're familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals. And I won't go through reading all of them. But if we go on to the next slide, I will zoom in on some of them. So why am I focusing, and for the purpose of our collective discussion, why are we focusing on urban settings? My experience with GHTC, with the Humanitarian Activities Committee, and many of the projects that have been proposed that I have evaluated for possible funding, when I have traveled, I've heard about a great deal of this, relate to rural settings, which is understandable considering the size of the planet and the minute fraction of the planet's surface covered by cities, and the enormous majority that is covered either by wildland or by farmland. We also understand the importance of food and the fact that people not only live far away from cities, but they produce much of the food that is consumed in cities. One of the early books that I read about addressing poverty, I have it right next to me. It's called Out of Poverty by Paul Polak, and it's a book that was recommended by HAC. It's a very, very good book, introduces some very useful principles, but it's all about rural settings. So because my own experience with poverty was urban, growing up in big cities in Brazil, I have always been concerned about that. And recently, and so what I list as a first hint is that, if you're trying to go deeply into something, you need to select it. You need to narrow down your field. So I have decided that for my purposes, I am narrowing my field to urban settings, and I will need to narrow it further as time goes by. Number 2 is the numerical trends, which I will comment on briefly, as well as because of the numerical trends, the needs are growing greater and greater in cities, and the complexity justifies more attention by professionals such as all of us and all of you. Next slide, please. So, recently, we have seen curves comparable to some of these describing the spread of the coronavirus, the number of infections, the number of hospitalizations, the number of deaths. This is world population growth. The book, the chart on the left is from a book that has had a great deal of influence on me, even though I have not, I'm being honest with you, I have not finished reading it. And it is one that I hope many of you will also read in the future. I find it to be a very interesting book because it is written by a physicist about the general principle of scaling. And he talks about cities after having talked about living creatures and about the scaling principles that take you from the smallest living creatures to blue whales, the largest currently existing living creatures. Extremely interesting discussion, and some of the fantastic, mathematically very perplexing scaling laws that apply to mammals. Anything that breathes in air, extracts oxygen, has a heart, kidneys, an intestinal system. The way we scale as you go from the tiniest creature to the blue whale is fascinating. And the fact that, for example, the number of heartbeats in a lifetime is the same regardless of which of those creatures you are. So he then addresses companies and cities using the same mathematics that he has published as explaining the scaling of living creatures. So the chart on the left, it's very back 10,000 years, and near the end, before the curve jumps up, you have year 0. So when we transitioned from BC to Anno Domini, and then all of the other data points that rise in what appears to be a vertical manner, the first of those is 1800. The last of them is an extrapolation to the year 2040, and that's world population growth. On the left side, you have billions of people, and the scale goes from 0 to 10. The point being that the first billion, and there's a subsequent slide that describes this in more detail, so I'll wait until I get to that one to comment on that a little bit more. But on the right, we have a similar chart, except to the relief of all engineers and physicists, the scale is logarithmic. So it starts at 1 million, 4 million, 10 million, and goes all the way to, I think, 7 billion, 7,000 million. And it's interestingly described in terms of early agriculture and the semi-nomadic era, the era of the city-states starting, 40 centuries. That's about where the history of India begins, is in the blue region. And then in the purple region, the era of empires, that's where you started finding that you had guests who were not always very welcome as empires spread. Initially, in year zero, we had the Roman empires, but then so many others going into the red region where the British and ultimately the Americans did their imperialistic thing. But what we see is that the growth is faster than logarithmic. If this were logarithmic, you would have a straight line. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is that first chart, and I have transcribed some of the text that goes with that slide or with that chart in the book. And so the first quote asserts that along with the population explosion, there has been exponential urban growth on the planet, and that it's faster than exponential. In following the COVID-19 infection, we have been very concerned with the doubling time. And I don't know about India, but in the United States, they have been tracking in California and in New York. We want to see the doubling time increase. We want to see the exponential bend down. We want to see it slow down. And what is clear from this graph is that after 2 million years of the existence of humanity, we reached 1 billion. So to some rough approximation, you might say that the doubling time was 1 million years. Certainly it was many hundreds of thousands of years during that first, the first 2 million years. And then it only took 120 years to reach the next billion. And then the doubling times have decreased to mere decades. So that's extraordinarily fast, way faster than exponential growth. It is now slowing down and should continue slowing down until the end of the century, with the population stabilizing someplace near 10 billion. And you can correct me if you have a more accurate estimate. Next slide, please. Okay, so the chart on the left focuses the one that's actually sort of gray. Again, impossible to read it, so I will tell you, and I put a box on the right in blue that tells you a little bit about that tiny smudged chart on the left. But you can see something that is wedge-shaped and that has 3 different shades of gray. So the horizontal scale, and fortunately I have the book here. This is where future versions will have a cleaner version of that chart, and I may transcribe it so that instead of gray I have colored curves. So the horizontal scale begins in 1950, 70 years ago. The horizontal scale ends in the year 2030. So it covers less than 1 century. Horizontal scale is time, less than 1 century, starting in the middle of the 20th century. The 3 different colors correspond along the bottom to rural population. The middle one corresponds to urban population in less developed countries, and the top corresponds to urban population in larger countries. So what we see is that the middle wedge, which is urban population in less developed countries, is growing much faster than anything else. The other 2 are barely growing, with the rural population clearly having leveled off and decreasing. And so what experts suggest is that as we continue to climb the population growth to where we reach something close to 10 billion, the growth will be primarily urban and primarily in developing countries, which is no surprise to you, but that's, to me, one of the reasons why it's important for many of us to focus on the urban poor, right? The larger the population, the more urban poor you're going to have, because you always have a fraction of the population that are poor. And if this is happening in developing countries, then even more so. At the bottom of the slide, I just pasted in some news that I came across 2 days ago. This is from a news story in Peru. Lima has some of the world's most horrendous slums, most highly populated slums. And so what the headline says is that for the first time, and these are our researchers in Peru, right? For the first time, the Peruvian researchers say, for the first time, the number of urban poor is higher than the number of rural poor. And Peru is a country that has a high population of rural people dating back to before the white people arrived, and everybody in Peru was essentially rural, living in villages. Next slide. Thank you. So we're still in Peru, and I'm calling this Lima. Two views. We could very well do this for San Francisco, São Paulo in Brazil, Cairo in Egypt, Bangkok in Thailand, or any other major city, especially in developing countries. But even in the United States and in Europe, you have this. So on the right, you have the view of Lima, of which Peruvians are proud. This is what we put on postcards. The beautiful coastline, the road along the beach, and then this towering skyscrapers and the parks along the coastline. To the left, it just looks gray and beige and foggy. But if you were to zoom in on that photograph, you would realize that that is one enormous slum, and that is one of many slums. I'm glancing at the chat window and noting that, yes, somebody pointed out that Paul Pollack's work is in northern India, exactly. And somebody else asked about the name of the book with the chart. That one is called Planet of the Slums. Planet of the Slums, and the author, I know that we're going to run out of time, but I wanted to include this anyway. Let's see if I can type this in. Planet of Slums by Mike Davis. And he's written more recent books. This one is from 2005. I want to find some of his more recent books. Okay, next slide, please. So back to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This is just to remind us that as we think about sustainable development, sustainable technology in environments such as Lima, whether it's simply the poor neighborhoods or whether it's the neighborhoods that aren't even neighborhoods, that don't have infrastructure, they don't have running water. They're in many cases squatters, people who do not own the land. But even though nobody owns the land, frequently residents pay rent to some kind of slumlord who, even though he owns nothing, he charges rent, right? This happens frequently. So in the context of places like that, if we want to address development and poverty, these 17 Sustainable Development Goals are the starting point. And the next slide shows a little game. Next slide, please. Excellent. So this is a little bit arbitrary, and each of you would do something different. So the question is, which SDGs for urban? And I have selected all of the ones on the top. No poverty, no hunger, good health, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation. All of those are going to be essential for the poor neighborhoods, for the pavement dwellers, the homeless. In my own neighborhood, right here in the Silicon Valley, every time I go for a walk to the park, which is 1 kilometer away, we have homeless people living in the park in the Silicon Valley. We have tens of thousands of homeless in the larger Bay Area. And so if we have that phenomenon here, why should it not be present in developing countries? And so it's a serious issue. I have selected 4 more from the next row. Good jobs and economic growth. Many of the working class in Rio cannot afford to live even in the poor neighborhoods. They cannot afford an apartment. They live in the slums, and they have jobs. Good jobs, infrastructure and innovation, reduced inequality, and of course, 11 sustainable cities and communities. This is where I'm hoping many of us will focus a lot of attention on what it means for a city to be sustainable and for a community to be sustainable. I include peace and justice, yes. I include peace and justice because we have, I was surprised. It seems to me like India has much lower, I may be wrong, but much lower crime than someplace like Rio. And there are places in the United States also where poverty and violence go hand in hand. And so to me, peace, I am putting in as the opposite of violence, whether it is organized crime or whether it is military violence of a totalitarian regime against its own people. Justice is fundamental because just as we have inequality of income, we have inequality of justice in so many countries, and that includes the United States, but certainly in Brazil. In Brazil, if your father is a billionaire and you are guilty of some horrendous crime, you will not go to jail. And even in the United States, whether you are guilty of a crime or not, you may end up in jail simply because our justice system is so broken. Simply because your skin is the wrong color and somebody in the police department needs to be able to close a case, they will put you in a room and they will say, we are accusing you of these crimes, and you wind up confessing so that you avoid a longer jail term. So the justice system is horrendously broken in many countries. And in order for communities to develop, we need peace and we need justice. And then, of course, I included partnerships for the goals. And we can continue the discussion offline. One more slide, please. So I have covered 4 of the goals, 9, 12, 14, and 15. Why are those covered? Well, the point is that even covering 4, we still have 13 out of the 17. Next slide, please. So 4 are gone for no reason whatsoever, and the answer is COVID-19. Next slide, please. So this is just a sample of what is faced because of COVID-19 in the slums I believe this is all over the planet, but this is from not a website, from an Instagram account maintained by 5 of the most famous slums in the city of Rio de Janeiro. Exactly, Darvia, Mumbai, exactly. That is one that I learned about from Rohan, who you will see listed on the Acknowledgments page. He lives in Mumbai and was a speaker in Mysuru when I was there 2 years ago. So what it says is the dilemma between prevention and working to have food. Again, so many of the dwellers in the slums work in the cities. They clean homes, they sell on the streets, they work in supermarkets, and you keep them at home, and they do not have savings. Some of them only have daily employment. They need to work every day. They take home money and food every day. When they need to stay at home, they very rapidly run out of supplies. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is from a report issued by the United Nations. So at the center, they have an icon that represents the coronavirus, and then they are relating the coronavirus to 13 out of 17 of this Sustainable Development Goals. So I'm going to ask Puneet, please skip one slide and go to the 2 slides forward. Okay, so going to the middle of that chart, you can almost read that under Sustainable Goal number 1, the concern is the loss of income, leading vulnerable segments of society and families to fall below the poverty line. Over to the left, under Sustainable Cities, population living in slums face higher risk of exposure to COVID-19 due to high population density and poor sanitation conditions. So there are 3 slides here. We have no time right now to go over all of them, but for each of those remaining 14 Sustainable Development Goals, it is rather obvious that the pandemic, our efforts to stop the pandemic, are interfering with those development goals. Next slide, please. Actually, we're going to skip these 3 and keep going towards the end. So that's just more of that. You can read that offline, and you can download the report. It's horrendous, but when I think about what's happening with food distribution being disrupted, with the devastating effect on health outcomes, or over to the water, I am very, very concerned about water. Rohan told me that in Darvi in Mumbai, that they receive water from trucks, and during ordinary times the population knows when the trucks will arrive, but that their livelihood is suspended when they need to stop and wait for a truck. One family member waits with the buckets or something, and that means they're not out there earning money collecting food. And now we don't know when the trucks are arriving. And furthermore, because people are stuck at home, people are sheltering in place, or trying to, in the slums, they're drinking more water at home. Prior to the pandemic, many of the people who live in slums had access to clean water at work. Now they're drinking more water in the slums, so the need is greater. And the same is going to be true for food. And again, for all of these. Next slide, please. Next slide, if we can.
Daniel, I'm at the end of the slide. 23rd slide I am having right now.
Oh, I see. What?
Hello.
Okay, that's good. So That's all right. I just wanted to acknowledge. And okay, if you can hear me, then having acknowledged these people, and many of them will be assisting me, I want to emphasize that Rohan is somebody that I met thanks to Puneet. I met him at the meeting in Mysuru 2 years ago, and we have remained in contact. He works with the inhabitants of Darvi in Mumbai, and is also in contact with West Africa. John Funso Adebayo at the bottom, he has recorded an audio for me describing circumstances in Nigeria. Patricia Guzman has workshops that she has presented at student meetings that are about extreme poverty. But if we can go back to slide 3, even for questions. Slide 3 was my outline. I intended to copy it at the end. Thank you. That's it right there. So this helps me to remember some of the things that I wanted to mention. I can take questions, but I want to mention the penultimate bullet item: crisis management and sustainability. That with COVID-19, it's very difficult to view this in terms of sustainable development because we are stuck. This is more like a hurricane or an earthquake. This is where we need humanitarian intervention all over the planet. I believe that I need to see the presentation by Dr. Ashok Das. This sounds okay. Actually, the concept of providing urban amenities in rural areas, I believe, is fundamental because one of the ways that cities have grown, and this was something that I saw in Brazil as a child, was that as automation impacted agricultural production, the multitude of small family farms was replaced by huge industrialized farms. Workers were replaced by machines, and they all went to the cities. If Pura had been in place, if there had been urban alternatives for the rural inhabitants, they would have benefited. One of the characteristics of the book that I mentioned called Scale is that the author identifies ways in which just as the efficiency of mammals increases with size, it is true from a theoretical perspective, and many would say from a practical perspective, that as cities grow and grow in a healthy manner, that they become more efficient and they can provide better support for the populations. So I do believe that question about urban amenities for the rural population, I believe that is going to be part of the solution. I see another question about the 2 types of poor. Exactly. Yes. I think that there are instances already within IEEE, projects conducted by previous teams with support from HAC Insight. But again, IEEE is a relatively small player in the worldwide space of development. So in many cases, for people who are invisible to institutions, I believe that we have something like a third of the world's population lives in extreme poverty and are simply not part, they are excluded from the formal labor force. Probably many of them are even invisible from the perspective of documentation. So unless we have public policy and private organizations, yes, thank you. That's correct. The book by Jeffrey West, Scale, The Universal Laws of Growth. That's correct. Without intervention from governments through policy and through NGOs, it's difficult to understand how those most marginalized poor can survive. But there is another tendency, another trend within IEEE that I find very encouraging. It is not new. It was present at the meeting that Puneet organized when I was there, which is increasing the awareness that engineers have, IEEE members of all flavors, even physicists like myself, of the importance of entrepreneurship and what it means to turn an idea or a principle, an invention, into a business, and to as it were, to hack, to turn upside down the concept of entrepreneurship, which historically has helped to create more wealthy people, and to say, no, we are going to use entrepreneurship to create jobs and livelihoods for the billions of poor. And I don't know how that's going to happen. I'm a physicist, but it's a challenge to everyone who is an expert in entrepreneurship. The balance between the lockdown and economic growth, that is the multi-billion-dollar question. It frightens me just to think about that, because already the lockdown is threatening to cause starvation among the planet's poorest. If we ignore the lockdown and try to recover our economies, then we are going to destroy not only the lives of millions of people, but we're going to, in many cases, destroy our health systems. We could lose the majority of our current generation of doctors and health practitioners if we allow the disease to simply run wild. That, to me, is simply not an option. Again, I am not an expert. Another challenge is what kind of enterprises are capable of existing by tapping into the labor force that is sheltering in place. It is easy for somebody like Puneet or Daniel, when we have Wi-Fi and computers and we can connect to our places of employment. But what about people who have no Wi-Fi, no computers, and whose work is done with their hands? So I don't know, really don't know. I think that really this is a situation that needs to be viewed as a humanitarian crisis, and without very strong public policy changes, I don't see us escaping this. I am truly saddened by the impact of the pandemic on education and the connection between what is happening in education, all levels, from preschool to graduate school. This is impacting people, with the impact the largest on the youngest students. But there is a direct connection between this and even the sustained economic activity of high-tech companies. I have colleagues who are PhD researchers at Silicon Valley companies, and they are trying to work from home, but they're also homeschooling their children. So no, it's extremely complex. Let me look at this last question. So yes, urban poverty is proportional to the rural to urban migration. It's not exclusively caused by that migration, but it certainly is due in part to that. So it's proportional to it. So yes, sustainable technology should go alongside efforts to provide economic opportunity in rural areas. This is why I think we talk about smart villages and about urban amenities in rural areas, because it is more effective, more efficient for people to live. At least this is the lesson I learned from the book about scale and cities, is that it is more effective for people to live in cities. Of course, if nobody is producing food, then that is an issue. If food is still produced by family-owned small farms, then this gets complicated. Exactly. One remark about lab work not done from home. That is absolutely true. No, this is not a sustainable situation, whether it's for education and students who are unable to do lab work from home. I know that historically there is an institution in the United Kingdom called Open University, and long before we had computers used for distance education, the Open University was using radios and televisions to provide education to people, and they would literally mail lab material to the students. So if there were any way of adapting that to the current situation, but again, I don't see how to scale that. That is a solution that worked for thousands of students. I can't imagine that how that would be scaled up, but that's a response. I think that the issue of population growth and governments having an impact on that, I think that education is going to be the best approach. I think that, and again, I'm a physicist. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a political scientist. This is one reason why we appreciate the need for partnerships between IEEE members and people who are social scientists, political scientists, but we have, I believe, I've heard people claim and show data correlating the education, especially the education of women and girls, and their incorporation into the workforce with population growth. So many families end up having more children because of two things: infant mortality and the need for a workforce. Children become the workforce for the poorest families, whether they are rural or urban. In Brazil, some of the poor have large families because they need their children to be out begging or collecting recyclables. And of course, those children do not go to school. So education in countries like Brazil, where they combine education with providing food and nourishment to children, is one of the solutions. And if you can put those children in schools and educate the mothers and get them involved in the workforce, then things have been shown to change. Boy, which among them, the Sustainable Development Goals? There's a question here about which need immediate work to be done. I think that especially with the pandemic, there is extreme urgency for food and water and medical treatment. And then, prior to the pandemic, or with the pandemic aside, I still believe that it is possible on a community by community basis to determine what the priorities are. But this is where I believe it's important to communicate with communities and have a bottoms-up approach, a grassroots approach, where we listen to the needs of the people, and where we have experts in urbanization and social sciences examine the situation. Because just as a medical doctor is able to diagnose a patient who cannot self-diagnose, I believe that we need experts who can diagnose unhealthy communities that are impoverished, in ways that even the community could not self-diagnose. And that will help us identify the most important goals, sustainable development goals. I like the remark that Prithvi is offering about 2% of the world population having 98% of the collective wealth. And the Robin Hood approach is one that tempts very many of us. And we hear, for instance, in the United States, under President Trump, well, I should not go into that right now. Let me just point out that I will allow the political scientists and the economists to comment on this. My belief is that 98% of the wealth belonging to 2% of the world population, number one, I refuse to accept that as being inevitable because of the second law of thermodynamics. That to me is just as obscene, as horrendous as having 30% of the population living with an income that corresponds to way under 75 cents a day. So obscene poverty and obscene wealth are extremes that I think could be avoided, at the very least, by human compassion and love. But we need to back that up with policy, technology, and I believe in free market economy. It's hard to distinguish the role of the government from the role of private enterprise. But Amartya Sen is an author who has influenced my understanding of and my interpretation of what the freedom in a free market should imply. Let me ask you, Puneet, if you have seen questions that you would like me to address. I see more questions coming up here, and I can continue reading them. But if you would like, you can join in directing our conversation. Or maybe you know individuals who are on the call who could also address the questions.
Daniel, thank you very much. I think there was some network issue at my end. First of all, I want to know whether I am audible.
I can hear you.
Yes.
Daniel, you are able to hear me?
Yes.
Chengappa, you are able to hear me? Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I think you missed initial two questions, Daniel, so I will read them. So if you are able to answer, that will be very good. First one was, if lockdown continues and small businesses are blocked without income, it might lead to crime rise. So what is your perspective on this?
I think that I agree entirely that when individuals, especially individuals who are responsible for feeding their families, find that there's two mechanisms at least. Find that they are no longer able to generate the income and provide the food for their family, people become desperate, and some of them, not all, some of the desperate people will resort to crime. And then the other mechanism, the other concern is that with people sheltering in place and locking down their businesses, the businesses become vulnerable to crimes. So even criminals who were already criminals a year ago, individuals who already were committing burglaries and crimes, will take advantage of this situation with so many empty businesses to behave in a criminal manner and destroy things and steal things. So that is, it's very frightening.
Yeah. So now another questions which we missed was, what were some of the best impact site or HSC projects to help urban poor?
Okay, I would love to return to that in a month or so. I will just mention a few that I heard about, and a few that I recall from the GHTC meetings and from reading projects. Sometimes the projects are as simple as one from Chile, where a park was identified in a low-income neighborhood, and it was a park that had been neglected by the authorities and had become a location where crime was taking place. And so this particular group of IEEE volunteers submitted a proposal which was approved, and they went in and installed lights. Something as simple as that. And by illuminating the park very well, that radically reduced the crime rates. I believe they also went up and did some maintenance, some cleaning in the park, cleaned the vegetation, painted the benches. So that's a small example. A larger scale example is what has been done in the way of point of care health and diagnostics. So there are organizations that have made presentations at GHTC that maybe don't have support. They maybe don't have funding from IEEE, but that have spoken about technology, often involving microfluidics and reagents that can be carried in large quantities out to locations, or can be sent to people's homes, or carried by nurses or health practitioners into homes to conduct diagnostics that normally would be required in a laboratory. So that is an example that addresses one of the Sustainable Development Goals. There have been a lot of projects like the ones on my cover slide addressing the energy poverty in urban areas, where IEEE volunteers have requested support and have obtained support to go in and set up solar panels. Now, this has worked well in rural areas, and in urban areas, the concern is that the solar panels are vulnerable to vandalism. So it depends very much on the exact location and on the culture of the people who live in the community. If they are going to throw rocks, somebody in Brazil told me they knew of solar panels that had been used as targets where people were literally using handguns, firearms to shoot at the photovoltaic panels. Then, of course, it's pointless for IEEE to fund projects like that. I've seen projects involving the electrification of schools that had previously not, even in urban areas, not allowed illumination to continue during the late afternoon, no heat, or no computers. So those are a few examples. And then I know that around the world, I heard about this from John Funso Adebayo in Nigeria, and I've learned about this from my contacts in Brazil and the rest of South America. There are projects being supported by the HAC, like hackathons for solutions that relate to COVID-19. Now that's very, very current, but even prior to that, when I went to Brazil last year, one of the interesting projects that will, I think, eventually migrate to other portions of the world are competitions where students and professionals are encouraged to think about humanitarian entrepreneurship. I like that one, affordable bulletproof glass for solar panels. Sure, why not? That allow all of the ultraviolet to go through.
Yeah, so thank you very
man.
much, Daniel. I think if we will continue, questions will be coming on, and we will be having discussions. Thank you very much for your enlightening lecture. And you are sitting in United States, and we are listening in India. And the most important thing, what is different in your presentation versus what we have done previously, we could find that the global perspective, and the first slide which you showed, I was stunned to know that it was a slide from Rio, whereas I was believing that you might have taken some photograph in India itself, because the locations and poverty which looks was so similar in Indian cities. We cannot discriminate whether it is you are showing urban poor of the Rio or from India. So that shows that the topic what we are discussing is omnipresent and needs a lot of discussion and what you can say army of volunteers to tackle it, because we cannot sit idle and listen about what government is doing. It is our also responsibility to do something for the society. Thank you very much for this wonderful webinar. And on behalf of IEEE Bangalore section, on behalf of all the participants, and on my own behalf, I would like to thank you very much. You can give now your.
Well, you are.
Yeah.
You are very welcome, and I am very honored to be on your list. And it has been a pleasure interacting with each of you. I apologize for the glitches, and yes, we will make the material available, but I wish to enhance it and make an improved edition of it available in the near future as well. So.
Yeah, so we would like to have you again during our BHTC. I know travel may not be possible, so we will again take you online, and then we'll be happy to have you once again to listen your perspective on these things and how much you have progressed on working these things. Thank you very much.
I will plan that. Thank you very much.
So thank you all the participants. Thank you very much. Now we are ending today's webinar. Tomorrow we are going to have our last session again at 6 p.m., which I will be taking, and I will be summarizing whatever we have done in Bangalore section, as well as what we are doing in IEEE regarding humanitarian activities So please do attend tomorrow 6 p.m. I will be with you. Thank you very much. Till then, bye bye. Good night. And good day to Daniel.
Thank you.